Oh, it looks like we are live. So that leaves me to say hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, the Sunday streaming edition. And today I want to talk about some musical rebels. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean musicians who had a clear vision, not just that they wanted to rebel against things for the sake of rebellion. That kind of thing I would class under musical novelties rather than true rebellion. Because to be a true rebel, contrary to what the great James Dean might have said, Jimmy Dean and James Dean, you've got to have a cause against which you are rebelling. And all of these musicians did. So let's get right into it with our first great musical rebel. Pardon me. And this would be Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, Bach rebelled against the idea that music is something that is just an afterthought, just a component of a wider experience. In his case, the liturgical experience, which is obviously a very profound and central thing to the lives of millions of people. But Bach said that the music, he said to himself, figuratively, of course, that the music itself should be able to stand on its own as a kind of spiritual offering to God, Bach being an incredibly religious Lutheran. And in so doing, he created just about everything we understand about modern harmony, modern chordality. What Bach did was really set a musical template for what the human mind can do with the sounds that organically appear in nature and how those can be artificially, in the sense of art, that's where we get the word artificial, how they can be arranged in certain combinations and patterns to create things that are beautiful and evocative and emotive. And in many ways, every great composer, every great songwriter, every great player is chasing what Bach was able to do. And we don't even have all of his compositions. Many have been lost, which shows you just how prolific Bach was. Now, let's fast forward to what I would call the modern age of music and the first great modern rebel, and this is Beethoven. Because Beethoven took the idea of the symphony and he turned it from something that, yes, Mozart helped to push forward in terms of his lyricism and his harmony, but what Beethoven did was absolutely blow the doors open. Music was now the main attraction. It became, certainly for me and many others, including Wagner, who we'll get to soon, it made music the central art form of this modern era. Because when we look at European history, when we consider late modernism, we're looking at the era of 1789 or roughly thereabouts and after. And it was in this era when Beethoven really created his finest compositions and the majority of his symphonies. And they were absolutely mind blowing and life affirming and world changing, not only in the world of music, but I would argue that they inspired life, sociology, politics, other art forms, and even the way we think about the divine. Beethoven was just that important. It's as though before Beethoven, the active composers of the prior generation were almost forgettable side notes, and that when Beethoven came, everything had changed. It's hard to emphasize just how different he was. But listen to, let's say, not to put him down, but listen to a Haydn symphony. And it's pleasant, but listen then to a Beethoven symphony. And it's the difference between gaslight and electricity, the difference between black and white and 70 millimeter cover. It's the difference between the horse and carriage and, a Bugatti. Just in any one of these analogies that you can think of, that is just how important Beethoven was. So much so that the next great musical rebel saw Beethoven as a kind of God on earth when it comes to music. And this man was Wagner, who was a great rebel in his own right. He changed not only the way that we conceived what opera can do, he turned opera into something from artistic entertainment into a more pure and rarefied and exciting and narrative art form. His advances of the modern orchestra in terms of size, precision, artistry, adding new instruments, inventing new instruments, the Wagner tuba that he invented, creating egalitarianism in music, shaping the modern concert hall and opera house so that the boxes that segregated people by social class and birthright, they were gone, and they were replaced by a curved opera house at Bayreuth, where all of the attendees had an equally good experience in terms of sound and sightlines. The element of drama that he added to opera, the overtures that he created, which are kind of like symphonic poems in and of themselves, the revolution he created in conducting, literally inventing everything we know about modern European conducting, that was Richard Wagner. I know I'm forgetting his harmony, his melody, his leitmotifs, the essays that he wrote about music, which gave us the contemporary understanding about how to experience and appreciate and enjoy music. All of that comes from Wagner. And now I'm just wondering if my microphone is on. Hmm. I think it may well be. If not, I'm talking to myself, but hey, I'm having fun. So, yeah, Wagner was another one of these great rebels, and he, along with Beethoven, are probably the two most important musicians of the 19th century. Liszt was also a great rebel around the same time as Wagner. He really, especially in terms of his piano, created a kind of virtuosity hitherto unknown. Now, his musical poems were for orchestra were very revolutionary as well. But when you look at what he did for solo piano, he elevated the level of virtuosity required to be a modern pianist in the same way that Wagner elevated the virtuosity required of the modern orchestral conductor, the maestro, the great soloist, orchestra players themselves, and vocalists. And so, in terms of creating music that pushed people to the limits, they were rebels. And I would say that Wagner and Beethoven are tied in, as is Liszt, because Beethoven composed music that was frankly more virtuosic than most of the musicians of his day could handle. You could make a very strong argument that post Wagner and post Liszt, the best Beethoven performances ever were given, superior even to those in Beethoven's own lifetime. Now, Brahms isn't usually a musician considered a rebel. He's usually considered a throwback or a reactionary, but that too is a form of rebellion, because in this age of the grand opera and the symphonic poem, and of ultra and of programmatic music, meaning music set to a story, set to a theme, Brahms said, no, I'm going to continue writing absolute music, music that doesn't have a programmatic theme. In other words, symphonies 1, 2, 3, 4, and the music will speak for itself. This itself is an act of rebellion. So while Brahms was musically conservative compared to Wagner, I would still consider him a sort of counteraction and therefore a rebel. Bruckner, one of the great symphonists of the late 19th century, he was a rebel because he was a devout Catholic and poured his faith and devotion into all of his compositions. And he was doing it at a time when European art, particularly in places like Vienna, was becoming ever more secular. This itself was an act of rebellion, something that Wagner very much appreciated. And it's why he befriended Bruckner. Now, who else can we look at? I would say the big Russian five, the mighty handful as they were called, were rebels because following on from Mikhail Glinka, they did something that was hitherto unknown in Russian culture, and that was creating folkish music using the art music, the classical music symphony borrowed from European cultures. Prior to this, Russian music was divided between liturgical chants, which did not have any instruments. Unlike Protestantism and Catholicism, the Orthodox Church does not use instruments. And so when Glinka came around in the early 19th century, he took Russian folkish themes but elevated them to the refined modern symphony orchestra. And then the mighty handful, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Balai-Kyriv, the critic Cui, Cesar Cui, they took this and invented an entire new school of music, almost out of thin air. Glinka invented it, and then the five, the mighty handful, took it places that no one in Russia and no one in the wider world expected. And I'll also say that a musical rebel was a great Russian composer outside of this tradition, and that was Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky ignored the folkish and national protestations of the Five. He likewise ignored the trends of Wagnerianism and Listism going on, Listomania, we can call it, going on in Europe at the time. He instead looked to the early Italian composers of the Renaissance and slightly thereafter for his inspiration. He also looked to Mozart. So he was someone taking his inspiration from places very far removed from the musical trends of the day, both in his country and in neighboring European countries. So, does that make him a rebel? Absolutely. Sticking with Russia, the next great rebel is Alexander Scriabin. Now, Scriabin's sense of harmony and his sense of compositional integrity and movement, in a literal sense, was absolutely unlike anything that came before him. It was as though Scriabin had divine inspiration from above. Now, the way that he conceived of musical performance was equally revolutionary because for him, every sound that is naturally occurring has a theme of light, of vision, of visual stimulation that goes along with it. And he therefore wrote down what he felt was the natural relationship between certain events in the sonic world and certain events in the visual world. And he even created a unique instrument to convey this called a light organ. And his fifth symphony, the Promethean Symphony, the poem of fire, it was intended to be played with this light organ in the concert hall, so that as the maestro was conjuring various sounds from the orchestra and the choir and the piano, it's a huge piece, this light organ would produce the appropriate lights in the concert hall, the light combinations that went along with this music. A truly brilliant musical and philosophical mind. Scriabin absolutely did amazing things. Now, this one might be a bit counterintuitive, but I would say that Aram Khachaturian, the great Armenian composer, was also a rebel because in an age where music was becoming ever more removed from folkish traditions, ever more removed from romanticism, ever more removed from the kinds of things that large audiences, Wagner-sized audience wanted, Khachaturian was able to do two things. He was able to explore an ultra-modern sense of harmony, complete with octatonic scales all over the place, while still making music that was folkish in its background, neo-romantic in its appeal, and broad in terms of how he was able to offer modern classical music to the masses. That is definitely a form of rebellion. He even suffered for it a bit because of that, but I think that absolutely a rebel there. Now, turning to other genres, turning to jazz, let's look at Charlie Parker Bird. He, along with Dizzy Gillespie, invented modern bebop, and that was a form of rebellion. Just as jazz was becoming ever more commercial and ever more elaborate in the swing era, they called these big bands the swing orchestras. Bird and Dizzy brought it back down to a more intimate and communicative form where the solos became more important than the arrangements, and in some ways, even more important than the head, the melody line. Then there's probably the greatest musical rebel from jazz, Miles Davis, who changed, in his own words, and he's absolutely right, changed music multiple times. He started off in bebop, then went to modal jazz, which gave birth to a subgenre of cool jazz, then orchestral jazz that was highly arranged, the stuff he did with Gil Evans, then his sort of flirtations with the avant-garde, the fact that he plugged in and went electric. He then explored sort of funk music, electro-funk, hip-hop. Everything Miles did was an act of revolution. And I also have to say that if we're talking about jazz fusion, we have to put down the drummer who played with Miles and everyone else, the great drummer Tony Williams, as a great musical rebel. Because I would say that even before Miles, Tony Williams invented jazz rock fusion as we know it. He was always uncompromising, and each album was different than the one before. Each one so exciting, from the rocky chaos of the Emergency album to the more groovy but still somewhat chaotic sounds of of Turn It Over than what he did in the mid 70s with Believe It when he brought Alan Holdsworth into the fold, and so many of the other greats that Tony Williams played with, a true consummate rebel. As was John Coltrane. John Coltrane turned modern jazz into spiritual music. Just as Bruckner was a musician who went against the tide by putting so much spirituality into his playing, so was John Coltrane someone who absolutely made his music inexplicably tied into the spiritual, as did his spiritual musical son, Pharoah Sanders, one of the best saxophonists ever, whose entire output was just so different than everything else. And he launched so many other great careers, Norman Connors, for instance, Lonnie Liston Smith, and everything he did just drew you in. It was one part ethereal, one part fully improvised, one part so calming and so listenable, all mixed into this music that was among the most dynamic ever in what we broadly call jazz. Sun Ra, was he jazz? What was he? Sun Ra was sort of the American version of Stockhausen, another great rebel. Now, Stockhausen, as I said on a previous video, was a true rebel because the atonal and the very experimental music he created wasn't even intended for this species. He admitted that his music is a difficult listen to your average human audience, but he said that this is due to biology. He would be the first to admit that objective biological truths relate to how we find certain music as a species beautiful or spooky or happy, all of these emotions that we derive from the music. Stockhausen would actually agree with many of the anti-modernists who says that we are biologically programmed to respond to certain kinds of music in certain kinds of ways, and that his music was intended for people from another galaxy whose biological programming actually allowed them to appreciate his music the way that us humans can appreciate Beethoven. Sun Ra had his own very interesting cosmic ideas. And his music was very much versatile and musically diverse. It could go from, again, things that were jarring and difficult to harmonies that were unusual yet beautiful and compelling. Solos that could be melodic 1 minute and seemingly anachronistic and anarchistic the next minute. Arrangements that could be, you know, huge and intimate at the same time. He was also someone that didn't consider himself a human earthling. He considered himself a son of Saturn. And when you listen to Sun Ra and his orchestra, as he called it, music, you can definitely see why. One of the great American, or shall I say, Saturnian rebels in all of music. Now, who else can we put on this list? I jotted a few of these down, so I guess it's time I better look. I think I've covered most of them. Ornette Coleman, someone who you could say helped to invent avant-garde jazz. Dave Brubeck, someone who you could say really turned odd time signatures into something that people in the jazz world wanted to pursue. Now, here's one that you weren't expecting: Frank Sinatra. Now, why was Frank Sinatra a rebel? Because in an era where music was getting ever more intimate, he pushed music into a level that was that much more cinematic and and that much more grand. And I would say that this happened first when he invented the concept album in the 50s, because when the long playing record came out, most musicians didn't really know what to do with it, because apart from the classical world and the operatic world, musicians were working in the realm of songs, of singles. And so many of the first albums by pop artists were, a few singles and a bit of filler. We saw that happen again in the 90s for other reasons, which I went into on yesterday's stream. But Sinatra, in inventing the concept album, went against the grain and said, no, we musicians of the pop world can produce something both musically and thematically consistent across two sides, around 45, 50 minutes of an LP record. And as he became increasingly musically mature, he brought in wonderfully talented arrangers, the classicists of their day, the neoclassicists, if you will, people like my favorite Don Costa, people like the great Gordon Jenkins, people like Nelson Riddle. And he created out of pop songs mini symphonies, mini symphonic suites in the form of these highly arranged concept albums. And while his music, certainly in the 60s, appealed to more conservative audiences than people like the Beatles or Elvis, it was nevertheless musically an act of rebellion. And the fact that he would then incorporate modern songs, including from rock and roll, in his great 70s albums that, as I've said before, are very unfairly overlooked. The fact that he was able to do that, but with these lush arrangements by Don Coster and others, definitely an act of musical rebellion. Now, prog rock is definitely an act of music rebellion because Chuck Berry, one of the great rebels who invented rock, wrote the song Roll Over Beethoven to cheekily and sarcastically differentiate rock and roll from the more supposedly conservative styles of European classical music that preceded it. You know, Roll Over Beethoven, give Tchaikovsky the news. Well, the progressive rock era turned that on its head. Electric Light Orchestra, a band I would consider progressive, literally recast Chuck Berry's song into a neoclassical rock fusion bonanza. But when you look at virtuosos like Keith Emerson, who brought serious classical piano into modern rock and roll audience consumption. When you look at Rick Wakeman, who really had a flair for neo-Bachism in many ways, and what he did along with Emerson as the two great keyboardists of that genre. Pardon me. When you look at Steve Howe, whose guitar playing was sort of very understated yet virtuosic in an era when people were going more and more over the top into with effects and different sounding guitars. He with his hollow body keeping it pure. That is an act of rebellion, as was the act of Monk Montgomery, the brother of Steve Howe's guitar hero Wes Montgomery, because Monk was the first bassist to forego the contrabasso and pick up the Fender jazz bass. He really invented how to play bass guitar. And every great bass player, from Jack Bruce to Stanley Clarke to Chris Squire to John Entwistle and Jaco Pastorius, to name a few, Alfonso Johnson, they all owed everything to an act of rebellion by one of the great and perhaps unsung musicians, the wonderful Monk Montgomery. Now, I would say the Mellotron was an act of rebellion. And for this, we can look at people like Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues, who really took the Mellotron front and center of music. The Mellotron was never really meant to be an instrument that bands would take out on the road, and it wasn't even meant to be an instrument associated with the rock or pop genres. It was meant to be an instrument that, much like the organ, would be able to offer many different sounds out of a single instrument. And this would have had a utility in live music venues, in the homes of wealthy people who could afford this huge instrument, in creating commercial jingles. But Mike Pinder, perhaps even more than the Beatles, I would say, took the Mellotron and said this can be a touring instrument that can be used just as with just as much utility and versatility as the electric piano or the electric organ. So I would definitely put him on that list too. Now let's see who else. I would say that jazz rock fusion in general, we talked about Tony Williams inventing the genre. This was totally new. Look at what John McLaughlin, who played with Tony Williams before starting Mahavishnu Orchestra, look at what he did with the electric guitar and turn an instrument that was associated with people like Jimi Hendrix and associated it equally with jazz and rock. Holdsworth, you could say the same thing. I would say all the jazz fusion people, Chick Corea's Return to Forever, Weather Report, because they were mixing genres up in a way that was so overt yet so musically honest that it was an act of rebellion, as was Keith Jarrett's giving up on electric instruments. He played them with Miles, but he gave up on them and stuck to acoustic, as did McCoy Tyner, as did Bill Evans. In the 70s, when everyone was plugging in, they were plugging out for the most part. Three super talented people, also acts of rebellion. Hip hop, an act of rebellion, because you're using musical reproduction technology, the turntable, as musical instruments. So, from a production side, that's rebellion. And the lyrical content itself, hip hop becomes stale when it's not conscious, frankly. And when they're not rebelling with their lyrics, rappers to me become uninteresting. And so, some of the best rappers either took production forward, the way, let's say, Dr. Dre and Warren G and DJ DJ Quick and DJ Pooh did, and A Tribe Called Quest, and some take it forward by finding new lyrical themes to rebel against, whether Schoolie D, Ice-T, Ice Cube, and MC Ren, Dr. Dre's collaborations with people like Snoop Dogg, Tupac, Kanye. Today is rebelling. And when all rebellion is new, people dislike it, but then a few years later, it becomes laureled. I mean, look at the MC5. They were rebels who were treated in the 1960s the way Kanye is sort of with his current rebellious music. But now the MC5 are Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. They couldn't even get booked in venues because people were so afraid of them. Again, rebels with a musical cause, rebels with a musical statement. Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins and Robert Fripp, who all around the same time decided that they don't want drums to sound like drums. They don't want drummers to play like regular drummers. And so this led to the cymbals that have been an important part of keeping time and creating drama on the modern drum set. These were removed by people like Peter Gabriel and his work with Phil Collins on his third album. Robert Fripp shortly thereafter, around the same time, said, let's remove the cymbals. Then you've got gated reverb, which changed the very sound of drums, making it sound much, again, much less metallic and much more sort of like a membranophone, the tom-toms and the snare. And then you have inventions like electronic drums in the 80s and drum machine, and a lot of musicians did interesting things with those. You have people like Bill Bruford who used electronic drums to create specific pitches. So he created pitches on the drum set, which is very unusual. And then you have the drum machine, which created a whole genre of music that didn't even require human drumming. Think all of those new wave albums. Think the people like Depeche Mode, who arguably took the absence of a human drummer further up the pop charts than anyone else. All acts of musical rebellion, and profoundly so, if you ask me. Dorothy Ashby, another great musician, because she created jazz harp, an instrument that most people never even think of as a true solo instrument, and that it plays solos in an ensemble. She put it into a genre that most people thought it never belonged. Alice Coltrane followed in her footsteps. Lynyrd Skynyrd, you could say, are rebels, both in the, the literal sense, the rebel flag, but also because in an era where music was becoming very urbane and effetist, they literally created music that took rock and roll very much back to its southern roots. And so many followed. The Allman Brothers technically came first, but I would say Lynyrd Skynyrd were even more pronounced in their overt acts of musical rebellion. Eddie Van Halen, in an era where the guitar was sort of becoming pretty repetitive, everyone just wanted to be a third-rate Led Zeppelin, who were rebels in their own right. Eddie said, I'm going to reinvent the electric guitar. I'm going to use these interesting arpeggiations. I'm going to make it very melodic, but I'm going to bring virtuosic music into songs that are very structured and accessible. The virtuosic solos plus the super accessible, super memorable hooks. Definitely an act of rebellion there. And finally, I mean, this list could theoretically go on for so long, but I'll end with Pat Boone, that least rebellious of all artists who, in the sort of final stage of his career, he is still going, he did a heavy metal swing album where he took heavy metal songs and put them behind a Las Vegas swinging show band. What goes around comes around. The ultimate act of rebellion from the person from whom you'd least expect it. So there we go. These are the musical rebels that I put on my list. There are many more that I'm forgetting, but of course, let me know in the comments who you are thinking of. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.